Good afternoon, colleagues. How's everybody doing? If you are in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, you're probably having a beautiful sunny day. So welcome. My name is Nomalanga Mkhize. I am the head of Department for History and Political Studies at the Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth. And I would like to welcome you to this our first of the year, but a continuation of a series of seminars that were begun by the under the DVC for Engagement and Transformation, as well as the chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education here at Nelson Mandela. We have a team here that's all here. The videos are off, but at some point, they will switch their videos on. I'll introduce them just now as we start. Just take note that we are going to be recording the proceedings, so that if you are worried about anything you say, just do know that it is recorded, just because this is for public purposes. Welcome also to any and all international visitors. Even though it's virtual, we still recognize that you're coming from across the space of the globe, and welcome to other colleagues from Mandela University, including students and colleagues. I'm going to invite Dr. Muthinda Nzioki, who is the acting director for the unit. Is it a center or a unit, Muthinda? The Center for Philosophy in Africa, just so he can greet everybody. Please give everyone the correct title before I butcher it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Muthinda Nzioki. I'm the director for the Center of Philosophy in Africa at the university. Thank you.
Thanks. You can definitely feel free to give everyone a welcome in more than one language if you wish.
Okay.
Just to emphasize. Yeah, karibu. Thanks, Dr. Nzioki. So I'm going to now invite our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Andre Kiet, who is the person kind of guiding and leading us in building this. Oh, sorry. Okay, just taking care of the noise, Jenny. Thanks. Thanks, Jenny will be helping with just making sure that we keep things under order, as well as Mzane Lemgati. So I'd like to welcome our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Andre Kiet, who is guiding the building up of this knowledge platform to try and really do this work on building networks and continuing to build strong knowledge production communities across the African space within his office in the engagement and transformation portfolio. So Prof. Kiet, go ahead, thank you.
Yeah, thanks Nomalanga. And of course, hello to Ebrima, Uchenna, Muthinda, Jenny, Anele, and Amy, for holding the space together. It's so great. And I can see all these great friends of ours joining us here on the sidebar. So thanks to all of you for making this the time. And part of the way in which I'm trying to introduce these events nowadays is just to say, dear friends and friends, because we are busy with building a fascinating connection across different, both epistemic divides and geographical spaces, thought processes, paradigms, and ways of viewing the world. So when we started with the idea of the seminar series, with the Mengele Institute, which is closely associated with the work of Uchenna, Nomalanga and Muthinda and Uchenna, I had a number of questions floating around, very, very straightforward questions, but they are profound in their simplicity, actually. So the one was, what does it mean to know Africa? Which was one of the questions that Muthinda also struggled with in his doctoral study. And who should we strive to become as Africans? was another question. In the here and in the now, something that has kept the mind of Uchenna going in different directions. And then what sources of thoughts are available to us for thinking and doing African? What artifacts, what imaginations? You know? And since we are now, I am directly referencing our series concept note, as I have done in the first seminar. Since we are only able to know the world through the conceptual options at our disposal in our specific spaces, the implication is that we must rely on these possibilities that shaped our imagination. What are these resources and how can we rethink them in the light of the crucial task of ensuring that Africans do not become prisoners of the freedom won from colonization? This seminar series is a response to this particular challenge. The aim is to identify, critique, decouple, remember the epistemic resources through which Africans have attempted to humanize the world and overcome the crisis of habitability on the continent. The Mandela University's aspirations for a transformative Africanized university or for generating African purpose interventions cannot take form without engaging with these propositions. And as such, this series is key for our institution and its beyonds and for our connections with, for instance, work that Uchenna is doing and for the other networks we are cultivating on our continent and of course in other parts of the world. And I see some of those connections in this seminar. It is also strategic and central to our project of revitalizing the humanities and the social sciences. And because of that, we could not have asked for a better interlocutor than Ebrima Sall for walking this journey with us. So we are particularly honored to have him here as one of our continent's great academic citizens, presenting on Of Tired Narratives and the Making of a Disposable People, unearthing the epistemic tools embedded in the African past. I know you will enjoy the seminar. Please participate in whatever form this platform allows, and thanks so much for joining us. Over to you, Nomalanga. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kiet. I now want to just draw just a little bit of attention to our co-hosting or partner guests from the Emengeni Institutes in the United States, which was founded by the family of the late great philosopher, Professor Fiani Menkiti. And I just want to welcome Didi and Carol to this. In fact, some of what we've been doing here, we began with a very beautiful engagement with the Menkiti Institute, really getting into some of the difficult philosophical questions of what it will take really to there she's gonna have a video on, of what it would really take to get Africa going. So this series is really a partnership with the Emengeni Institute with Prof. Okeja as the director and also a good friend of that project that's just really trying to build a new way to strengthen the way we continue to fight through these questions of African knowledge. So welcome to the Menkiti family. I see you all on the side there. Welcome. I see other friends as well. Hendrix there. I see other friends who are joining us, and we really appreciate everybody who is here. Let me just give a very brief, you should have all received the bio of the speaker, but if I can ask Dr. Sall to just put his video on so I can just do an introduction of him. I don't think he needs introduction to many of the people who have been engaging across the Pan-African space. You would have received his biography, but just for formality, he is the Executive Director. Dr. Ebrima Sall is the Executive Director of TrustAfrica, a Pan-African foundation based in Dakar, and he's currently just sheltering in place there in Dakar while they deal with some of the challenges of COVID. Even though Senegal has done quite well, they're still dealing with some challenges here and there. He was, of course, I think for many people who have engaged with him, key in his position as Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, or the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And of course, he has many, many accolades to him, including just working with UNESCO and many other institutions internationally on the continent, across the space, in dealing with some of these complex issues relating to our continent. And I just want to say we are very grateful to continuously have Pan-African minds under very difficult conditions of building or rebuilding Pan-Africanism in late capitalism. So welcome, Dr. Sall, and I'd like to welcome you. He will speak for 45 minutes. We are taking the space as a very as a space of engagement. Let me just say what we're trying to do here is give us the space to really talk. And I know that talking is something we're good at in Africa, but as we edge the conversations towards where we want to get to, the space must be there. So please do think of your questions or your comments, chat on the chat screen, put some there. And just when he's done, we will get into quite some lengthy engagement. Hopefully you'll have the energy for that. So can I please welcome Dr. Sall? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello, and thanks to my brother Andre, to Malanga, Uchena, Jenny, Tinda, and all those who have made it possible for me to be part of this conversation today. I feel greatly honored to having been given the possibility to participate in this interesting series of conversations on Africa and knowledge. I think Nelson Mandela University definitely ought to be commended for taking up this issue, and having this series with the Emerging Institute on Africa and knowledge. And talking about tired narratives about Africa, definitely the narratives related to Africa and knowledge are among those that really need revisiting, and we'll hear a little bit about them. But before going any further, I think it's just proper to, remind ourselves of what Paul Chiambezele, I would say, great Malawian scholar, historian, currently in Kenya. He made this point that we live in what he calls a global epistemological order. There's a global epistemological order that is currently in place, and that order mirrors in a very strange way the dominant global order. And that order, global order, is of course founded on a set of social and political relations, at the heart of which is obviously an institution, and that is the state. So there is a way in which a lot of relationships have been reordered and restructured within nations, and in the process, obviously, some have been subjected to terrible experiences by the more dominant ones and around the state, and that's a form of political organization that actually has become almost like universalized, and which is what made the French historian Henri Lefebvre talk about a state mode of production that has been almost like globalized before the term became very fashionable in its use. But going with that is obviously this epistemological order, which is what we are going to be talking about today. I'll be speaking, basically in two stages. First about the tired narratives, and then about the unearthing of epistemic tools embedded in our African past. Now, this lecture, as it has turned out, it's been held at a time when we have the COVID pandemic, as you've rightly said, that this has been disruptive, and that is still extremely disruptive at various levels, and we don't really know how long we're going to live with it still. But this is again one issue around which there are a lot of narratives related to Africa, and related to understanding that people have of the pandemic, the place and the risks that and the vulnerabilities that are said to be existing in relation to Africa. And this all is being done, and it's happening in total ignorance, let me say, of very often of what African communities, what African even African research in some instances has been saying about the pandemic itself. But more important is the lived experiences of communities and the knowledges and the experiences accumulated over the years in dealing with crises and epidemics over the years that have actually, enabled Africa to stand up to many other kinds of crises. CODESRIA has been mentioned a few times already. So I want to begin this lecture with a small personal note, let me say. I spent a total of 19 years actually working with CODESRIA. First as a program officer in charge of academic freedom, which got me to, be almost like on the front line in a number of instances having to do with, the kind of narratives and the kind of things that have been said about Africa and the practices, obviously, that are restrictive of, scholarly processes and academic freedom on the continent. But I, worked for 6 years as a program officer. Then I left, went to work in Sweden as a researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. And then I came back to CODESRIA as a head of research for 5 years before becoming the executive secretary. Now, I think CODESRIA, of course, as we know, has become the home of many progressive African scholars, from Samir Amin, late Achima Feje, Sheikh Anta Job himself was a member of the executive committee at one point. Tanikam Kandawire, Ali Elkens, Helmi Sharawi, Mahmoud Mamdani, Ashil Lembe, Bernard Magubane. I can go on and name a number of people who have been associated with CODESRIA. Of course, Andre, we were just saying a little while ago, we've had an engagement when he was at the Free State University. But Bane Pitiana, Adam Habib, Teresa Cruz Silva, and Shamil JP, a lot of people, a lot of good colleagues. Now, and of course, our own Puleng Lenkabula, who's now already or is going to be the principal of UNISA. But one thing that CODESRIA has been doing all the time and has been engaged in is precisely the whole issue of science as it relates to Africa, knowledge as it relates to Africa, and the narratives about Africa. And the CODESRIA project and the Pan-African project at the scholarly level is basically about, about knowledges and about societies, about perceptions, about relationships that are constructed, around those narratives as well. And so this is, in a sense, the milieu in which I grew up, basically, personally. And putting it very simply, CODESRIA, I think, had made its own and has made its own. Amilcar Cabral, invited Africans to do, and African intellectuals in particular, and that is to look at the world with our own eyes, not with borrowed lenses. And that we should also do that from where we are, and that is from the African continent. In his own words, he said, actually, we should think with our own heads from the realities in which we live. And so here is this platform that was constructed, CODESRIA, by African scholars, to engage in, as Samir Amin put it a few years ago, in making independent and audacious reflections about the contemporary world. So it was never a question of saying, look, okay, well, you know what, we are Africans, let's think about our own realities in Africa to understand. Of course, that was important, but it was about looking at our own realities and looking at the world from where we are and making a contribution, to scholarly debates, about everything that mattered in the world. Now we know, of course, all the criticisms that have been leveled at, mainstream social science, or what Kulurake call received social science, is reductionism, the way it has been, influenced by its own history, actually, of course, and the rapport that it has with Africa. But the interesting thing here is, I thought, having been in that milieu and seeing what CODESRIA was doing, well, we are on the right path. And then one day, discussing with a good friend of mine, Usman Khan, who is at Harvard University now, and he had just come up with a book on manuscripts. He had a hand list of manuscripts in several private libraries in Senegal. And he was very worried by what was happening to those manuscripts, many of which were, written in Wolof and other languages, but using the Arabic script. You're talking about Ajami here, which is what the whole Timbuktu project that South Africans know very well about, that Shamil Jepi in particular has been involved in. You know, the Timbuktu manuscripts are actually an illustration of the importance of that huge production, you know, of knowledge that has occurred over the years, and that has been lying, and that's been actually, you know, running the risk of, you know, being lost through deterioration or through the attacks of some, you know, on ruthless, you know, terrorist or armed groups that invaded the city a few years ago. But in the conversation, it just occurred to me that, look, you know, rather than only think about these manuscripts and how to save them, what were these manuscripts talking about, basically? What did we know? So I thought, you know, this CODESRIA that was established to transcend boundaries of all kinds, disciplinary, linguistic, you know, regional, geographical, so that we would form a community. We would make sure that these boundaries would not become epistemological obstacles, which is what the whole Pan-African project is about at the scholarly level, to make sure that these different boundaries don't become epistemological obstacles that, or limitations to the amount of knowledge we can generate about our continent or how well we would know it. It just suddenly occurred that, look, you know, we actually are in an extremely fragmented community, even as Africans. So on the one hand, we have this North-South divide, the terrible experience of having Africa been, you know, at the heart of what has been called the colonial library, narratives framed, you know, institutions shaped and produced and generalized and reproduced, the European institutions in particular, you know, through the encounter with Europe, we got to have them and borrow from Europe a lot of things that in the end, you know, had an impact on how science and knowledge is produced, what is called knowledge to begin with, how seriously a lot of knowledge is, you know, and realities and perceptions and ways of knowing of our continent are taken or not taken, actually. And then suddenly we realized actually within our own continent too, this actually has gone far, because, you know, here is this whole part of our community that was engaged in debates that were completely disconnected from what I was seeing being debated about at CODESRIA itself. So to cut a long story short, you know, this is how we got to be interested in getting a project written already, and you know, Swankan went ahead and, you know, wrote a book that was titled Non-Europhone Intellectuals, you know, which later on, you know, he developed further, and then has a, you know, a more recent book just for about 5 years ago on the meaning beyond Timbuktu. But the point here is that we are in a world that is extremely fragmented, and we have internalized the, you know, the frameworks we have taken for our own, the frameworks and all the instruments, you know, of domination that are part of the what I would call colonial project for the sake of it, you know, borrowing this term from the colonial scholars, and then using it even in the way we do science, including in our attempt to take a different look at realities, you know, within the continent and the rest of the world, you know, and without actually realizing that actually we are living, we are touching the surface and living out quite a lot. So in the end, you know, it was clear that there were other important intellectual debates that are going on the African continent, and very few African scholars actually could engage with the Timbuktu manuscripts, which, by the way, you know, have everything, including texts, you know, on Africans. Ali Sharawi has demonstrated that among the Ajami texts, some actually are Africans written using the Arabic script, you know, debating everything from history to culture, law, and other things. And so I think what this tells us is that we do have, through the, you know, the spread of the institutions to begin with, educational institutions and higher educational institutions, model on those of the West, and the social sciences and humanities as practiced from the West, actually not only a fragmentation, of our own community, but a sidelining of a number of knowledges and important debates that existed, and that we are now, left on the side. And actually, the Pan-African Intellectual Project is about is an emancipatory project, to put it simply, that seeks to go beyond received social science, what Kulolake calls received social science, number one. Number two, challenging the dominant narratives about the continent. Actually, one of the most important and natural starting points in that struggle to to have a different take on issues and make sure that there is if not a total transformation, at least a a contextualization of what Mudimbe called the colonial library. Yeah. So I think what I want to say here is to come back to the point I was making about tired narratives and knowledge. Africa has actually hardly ever been taken seriously when people are talking about knowledge production, both at the very formal, almost trivial level. When the counting is done, when the metrics are done, we are said to account for very little in terms of the amount of knowledge that is produced. Of course, there's a great degree of undercounting that's happening, but the fact of the matter is, it doesn't stop there. When Africa is said not to be actually a place where knowledge production has been taken, this is to ignore, what we now know, seeing the great Alexandria Library, Bibliotheca Alexandria in present-day Egypt, where one finds texts that were actually produced centuries before Christ. Looking at the pyramids of Egypt, just the way they are shaped, and they have withstood the test of time and all the elements over all these years, shows that actually there was a lot of knowledge that went into conceptualizing them and producing them, which maybe means that are completely different from the kinds of means that are available today. It actually makes people really respect the Egyptians. I'll come back to this point, because it has been argued that actually from the Egyptians there's been a lot of theft actually of inventions of theories and of that we are not acknowledged in books like Black Athena and others have been good references here. But the ancient Egyptians invented also other things, the techniques of mummification that enabled them to preserve the remains of their leaders, the pharaohs, for thousands of years. Algebra and mathematics was invented, in that part of the world. In French, by the way, when they talk about Roman figures, the other kinds of figures are called chiffre Arab, Arab figures. But with the spread of the globe and the globalization of the Humboldtian model of a university as the dominant, higher educational institution, the other institutions were completely downgraded, to put it very mildly. And yet it is now established that it is in Africa that some of the oldest degree granting institutions in the world today exist. The oldest of which is the Qarawiyyin University in Fez, Morocco, that was founded in 859 by a woman called Fatima Al-Firi. Fatima Al-Firi was the daughter of a rich merchant who inherited the fortunes of her father, and their family moved from Al-Kairouan in modern-day Tunisia and settled in Fez. But that institution is still in existence today, and it is important that it was founded in Africa, and it's still in existence, and it was founded by a woman, which also speaks volumes about the place that is supposed to be the place of women and knowledge production on the continent. Of course, the other and for her this was important, and one can see the association that was very directly established between access to knowledge, and the possibilities for not only social mobility but emancipation. The other institution is the University of Azhar in Egypt, and much more closer to us, I've mentioned the Timbuktu manuscripts, and there have been centers in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century in West Africa, many places in West Africa, Pir, in Walata in Mauritania, Pir is in Senegal, Timbuktu, and other places where there have been centers of learning where a lot of knowledge has been produced. And this, of course, is not unique to Africa. Outside of Africa, there are other centers as well. So I think it is important that we acknowledge that, that what we are dealing with here is this recentering what the colonial scholars call the late arrival of the West, in the scene, and then it being the point of reference now and being the center of everything and being taken to be the most, the most important center of learning and of knowledge and of everything, right? But when one sees Machu Picchu in present-day Peru, it's a civilization that one can see was extremely sophisticated, built on thousands of meters above sea level by the American Indians, and that has been important. Another important aspect of the dominant narratives about African knowledge is, of course, what is being said about Africa being a continent of orality, and that is said, with in a almost like a derogatory way, and of course, that is only partly true because you see the hieroglyphs in Egypt, you see Amharic region in Ethiopia, and a lot of other places where writing was not absent from the traditions of knowledge, generation and circulation on the continent, and it is also shown in some of the books that I've already mentioned, like The Meanings of Timbuktu by Shamil Jepi, and edited by Shamil Jepi and Suleiman Bashir, that the Timbuktu manuscripts are actually, collections, huge collections of works in using Arabic script for most of them, but discussing everything and in all kinds of languages. And that work has been extended by other scholars later on. And there is now a comprehensive picture actually of the societies and economies of the region that actually show that vibrant intellectual life that existed around Timbuktu, was supported by a vibrant economy. And one of the things that are very well known today is the fact that it is from the same part of the continent that Mansa Kankang Musa, or King Kankang Musa, decided to go on a pilgrimage to take in so much wealth with him that when he got to Cairo, the gold market collapsed for 12 years before it began recovering. So there's a whole political economy, that existed, and that is completely, absent from the conversations about history of development and of course, the big question that one is obliged to ask at this point is why the narratives, depicting Africa as an intellectual desert, or as a continent of orality, or as a continent, of poverty, and why were the narratives framed to begin with, and why they keep being reproduced. I think with the narratives about knowledge classified into scientific and modern, indigenous or local, the classifications of institutions, it's again, as I was saying, this order that was being constructed, an order that mirrored another order, which it was global and imperial, and supported by capitalist relations. And there's a lot of work already on this, and I think South Africans are very familiar with the debates, on the coloniality, including what our own Sabelo Gatchanindo and others have written on the subject. I think what I want to say at this point is that the intellectual communities involved in the study of Africa, both within and outside the continent, have been segmented for a bit too long, and beyond that segmentation, what is more troubling is actually the damage that has been done to African cultures, African languages, and African ways of knowing, and the fragmentation, became part of what has been called a very serious epistemic injustice, which is something that ought to be addressed, because it's a precondition for there to be any kind of global justice. I think with the process didn't end with the past. It continues, obviously, with what is happening to, as a particular form of neoliberal globalization is also, unfolding, and marketization of higher education and social sciences in particular, and reclassification of fields of knowledge, of disciplines, and of institutions, and there is what has been called by some scholars, the emergence of a wall of structural heterogeneity, and that there are asymmetries, obviously, that exist. And this is the subject of a lot of literature also, including a very well-known World Social Science report that was produced by the International Social Science Council and UNESCO a couple of years ago already. I think the important point here is that the relationships between knowledges and the relationships between intellectual communities has not been far from being a harmonious one. It's a relationship of power, and the relationship, really the big turn took place when from Europe at a particular point in the history, from the Renaissance, actually, before even the colonial, formal colonial experience began. The whole process of subjugating indigenous knowledges and understandings of, of the world in different parts of the world began becoming more generalized. So I want to go to this, second point about obviously in response to that, what has been tried, that there is an importance to obviously reconnect, remember the communities that are fragmented, and obviously take our own locals more seriously. I think what we mean when we go to the importance of unearthing the epistemic tools embedded in our African past. By the way, it was important, I think, that we remember. It's important that we remember that talking about the making of disposable peoples, if I may put it that way, it's not only disposable African peoples. These processes, as I said, have existed in other parts of the world as well, where particular nations, have become victims of certain processes related to state making and to and the structuring of particular social and political orders. That same process continued, and it is obviously one of the explanations as to why narratives were constructed. There's a huge literature, Pierre Tempels and a lot of other people have written on why African religions are not to be taken seriously. African cultures are not to be taken seriously. Everything African, but obviously that was serving a particular purpose, and that was part of the imperial project, to put it very, very, very simply. And obviously, to turn that whole thing around, we need to go back to what has been, demonstrably shown, apart from even having the pyramids constructed and having, including formal institutions like universities built by women on this African continent. There are examples, I think, that demonstrate that we need to, I think, be more systematic and in terms of unearthing the epistemic tools that are embedded in our past and in our present, I would add, because to begin with that particular point about the present, it has been demonstrated that even in this time of COVID-19, African youth have been having extraordinarily creative responses to climate change, to the COVID pandemic, and to other social and global problems. But I want to connect that with what is an experience that speaks to this whole issue of both Africa being a continent of orality, said in a derogatory way, but it actually, doesn't really capture the essence of the vibrance of African cultures and the importance of texts, including oral texts in our own history, but also in terms of the importance of knowledges that existed and knowledges that are mobilized to address issues and respond, to help Africa respond to challenges. And in the 13th century, in still what is present-day Mali, I said that there's a whole political economy that enables one to understand why you could get the Timbuktu manuscripts, you could get Mansa Kankang Musa, going on a pilgrimage and taking so much wealth with him that he ruined the market, the gold market in Cairo collapsed for 12 years. But it's in that present-day Mali, in West Africa, in the 13th century, was adopted a charter called the Krukang Fuga, and some people call it the Mande Charter. And the Mande Charter was adopted by hunters on the invitation of Sunjata Keita, who was the then leader of the Mali Empire. Now the Krukang Fuga is interesting, in many respects. First of all, in the 13th century, if just a few decades of distance between it and the adoption of another charter that is much better known, and that is the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta is is known for being one of the sacred texts of democracy coming from the West, and so on. But the Krukang Fuga, is actually extremely rich, in what it says. Article 1 of the charter says, every life is a life, right? It addresses a number of issues that have to do with race and gender relations, that have to do with relations between humans, between people and the environment in which they live, rules of war and peace, and so on and so forth. And the charter was adopted, with a very clear intention to end the trading in slaves that existed, that had actually been the cause of a lot of conflict and wars and instability in the region. And so all the communities involved, under the part of it, were represented in this discussion, and they adopted this charter that was discovered much later because it was an oral text. But it is striking in its sort of contemporaneity and in its propositions, actually, including when people talk about the environment, that they could consider taking Article 1 of that charter to be every life is a life. So today, when at one point you had in the conversations around COVID, whether it really mattered, where people died most or not. Well, of course, in our own history, we know that we are taught to value every life, that we are taught to create relations of justice and relations that are protective of the environment. So the Krukang Fuga is actually an extremely extraordinarily rich text that only later, elements of which only later became part of what has been called third generation rights. So here is a very clear, proof of the fact that, the notion of orality is not something that is actually was necessarily negative in our own context. More important is that there's an interaction between the oral and the written text, and today in the age of the internet and social media, people are doing extraordinary things, between using the oral text as well as the written text. But to come back to the Krukang Fuga, I think it is important that we remember that here was an attempt to end slavery and the trade in slaves well before it became scaled up, by the transatlantic slave trade, a couple of centuries later on. It was part of that whole context in which, knowledge was valued and it was cherished. And the interesting thing about being involving hunters is that actually, you know, here are people who had a particular relationship and a position in society, but also a relationship with the environment, you know, that enabled them to have, you know, a very fine understanding of, you know, of the issues and of the dynamics surrounding them. And then we are interested in building a harmonious relationship. So I think what this raises is the whole issue of ecologies of knowledge. It sort of is a counterpoint to the narrative that holds you know, the only valuable science being the science that we have, you know, inherited from the, you know, through our encounter with the West, and it doesn't stop there. I think there are a lot of other you know, examples in the, you know, in our history that shows that, look, there was actually a, you know, a great value attached to knowledge and to science and then ways of knowing developed. And I think it wasn't by chance that when in 2013 the organization of the African Union was celebrating the 50 years of the OAU and AU, and then thinking about, you know, what would later become the Agenda 2063, you know, one of the really big issues was the importance of reframing the narratives about Africa, reframing the narratives. And that was seen to be an urgent task of the years. Of course, it is out of the, you know, acute awareness of the fact that, you know, so long as, you know, we accept to be, you know, in a position where everything related to African is in a kind of subaltern, you know, position compared to the rest of the world, whether it has to do with trade or it has to do with other things, right? And in a sense, I think there is an, you know, looking at works of people like, you know, like Foucault and others who, in a sense, you know, have explained how obviously every system of governmentality has knowledge informing it. Every system of governance, to put it simply in modern day terms, has a particular kind of knowledge going with it. So therefore, to have the slave trade, you have to have a rationale for the slave trade. To have colonialism, you have to have a rationale for colonialism. You know, and these narratives, unfortunately, you know, have survived, you know, the passage of time in a number of instances, and one can still see traces of them in school textbooks, and which is why, you know, everything, the colonial scholars remind us that everything from history to culture has been, you know, victims of that colonial rapport that was built way back in the time of the Renaissance. And it was not by chance that you had, you know, UNESCO and more recently some national governments of West Africa in particular, also engaging in the rewriting of the histories of the African continent, general history of Africa, you know, also, yeah. And again, here too, it is not a problem that is peculiarly African. It's a problem of all oppressed peoples. Enrique Dussel, who's an Argentinian scholar who lives in, I think, Mexico now, wrote The Invention of the Americas in, I think the first edition was published in 1976. Now, Dussel shows how hundreds of millions of people, you know, in the Americas were turned into disposable orders of the West since the conquest, you know, of the Americas by descendants of Europeans. Along the same lines, you know how the Orient was constructed. Edward Said's, you know, beautiful text on Orientalism depicts a similar picture of, you know, how, you know, the Orient was constructed, you know, by obviously Orientalists, as they're called, who were, you know, part of the dominant, you know, order in Europe. And of course, it's along the same lines that Valentin Mudimbe is a Congolese scholar who lives in the US, wrote his Invention of Africa, followed a few years later by An Idea of Africa, or The Idea of Africa, and giving a detailed account of the construction of the colonial library. Now, I think these grand narratives about the construction of these different continents just shows that we are dealing with something actually that again, as I said, it's not peculiar to Africa. It has to do with relationships between cultures and the way in which the West has established itself to be the sort of the overall and the center of almost everything, from being the center of history to the center of politics to the center of globalization and global processes. And in response to that, we have, of course, what institutions like CODESRIA, Clarkson, and a lot of individual scholars and institutions have been trying to do. And I think it's obviously what also makes this initiative of the National University interesting as part of the response. Now, the struggle for the emancipation of whole continents of the South and peoples, and within the continents of the South, particular groups, obviously calls for particular epistemic tools. And I think one of the best illustrations of the kind of effort that is required here is what Boaventura de Souza Santos, is a Portuguese scholar, has written in his book called Epistemologies titled Epistemologies of the South. Now, Epistemologies of the South, it was inspired, according to Souza Santos, by his long years of interaction and participation in the World Social Movement, and which is an attempt, obviously, to build a different world and to build different relationships, at every level, including, our relationships with nature, our relationships with each other, intergenerational relationships, gender, and so on. And then there are specific epistemologies, feminist epistemologies, and different kinds of epistemologies that can be mobilized. And I think all that adding up to constructing what de Souza would call epistemologies of the South. I think to come back to where I started from, people like Cheikh Anta Diop, Joseph Kizerbo, and a lot of other great scholars, have been active within CODESRIA circles, and there are a lot of people, I'm sure, following this conversation, who have been part of the project, taking it up in different ways, starting journals or running journals, Hendricks and a number of other people. But the philosophy at the origin of the creation of CODESRIA was that actually there's a need for Africans to trust themselves and for us to trust Africa. This brings me to my own organization, the choice of the name of TrustAfrica, being motivated by an acute awareness of the fact that there is still work to do at that level, and being here on the ground, we know where it pinches, us in the shoe, and the importance of generating knowledge informed by the lived experiences of the continent, and that is something that we also need to remember. I want to begin wrapping this thing up a little bit by invoking again is a few texts that remind us of the fact that there are a lot of misconceptions. I mean, James Scott has, in one of his more later books, James Scott is did a wonderful book titled "Seeing Like a State" that I think takes me to what I was saying earlier on, that there is a particular kind of political rapport and an order that exists from the national level, that has been globalized and that is at the maybe epicenter of what has become the global order that exists now. Now, he shows in that book, Seeing Like a State, that actually everything from the way scientific forestry was invented to high modern projects were designed in a number of instances. It was an attempt actually to make societies more legible, to make societies easier to govern, and to govern human, not only interpersonal relationships, but more societal relationships as well. Now, in the more recent book, Against the Grain, Scott is arguing that actually this is very closely related to what we are discussing now, about knowledge and the knowledge production and the epistemic tools that are required, and that he's arguing in this book that to think that the hunter-gatherers were less knowledgeable than modern day American farmers would actually be a mistake and a misconception. That hunter-gatherers, had to have a very fine understanding of the weather, the environment, and how climate changes at every time of the year, and where to find what kind of particular, not only food, but also how to adjust to changes in the environment. And therefore, if the American farmer of today has to have an almanac that shows what is happening over the year at every time of the year, well, these people have to have many almanacs, so they are actually much more cultivated, much more cultured, and more knowledgeable about many, many, many things. I think it brings us back to this whole point about Africa and being a continent of orality and how people have been able to, mobilize knowledges. Unfortunately, our relationship to those knowledges for a long time, including at CODESRIA, was to say, well, we study indigenous knowledge. There was a multinational working group at one point led by the great philosopher Huntonji to say, look, we need to know how people were engaging in rain-making, witchcraft, and a number of other things that they're about local knowledge, and that maybe the thing to do is to try to find a way of, actualizing those knowledges and put them in the service of development. And of course, the debate that provoked, including with people like Suleiman Bashir Jan, was that there's been a paradigm shift, and that the conditions are not the same. You may not be able to do it. But the important point here is that our relationship to those knowledges is an externalist relationship. We engage with them, but we don't take them as knowledges to engage with, and interact with in a productive way. That we are not reasoning in terms of ecologies of knowledge, that respect and value and help us move towards what has been called pluriversality. Genuine universalism, as Samir Amin would call it, but more modern universalism is pluriversality with a lot of contributions and respect and spaces for, all the different knowledges that exist. And I think if one have to conclude, I would say the conversations have been going on for a long time, and they've been taken up by people at different levels. In one of his works, Jimmy Adesina, tells us how Akiwo and Onoge, looking at the Yoruba language, have been showing how the Yoruba have been, there's great sociological value in the way they were approaching a number of issues, and that there is something to learn from that. I think if I have to conclude on a few points, I would like to say that first of all, the issue of how the social sciences are constructed in the West is an issue that we still need to engage with, because they were constructed mainly as, tools of domination, not necessarily to, to correspond to the proclaimed objectives of the sciences, but in effect, they have been serving as tools of domination in a number of instances, or at least they've been put to that use, that even though they could be put to other kinds of uses as well. And reminds me of what I was saying about Scott. And Jacques Goody talks about the importance of, objective and universal knowledge. Right? He talks actually about, he's the one of those who have spoken about African sciences of ancient Egypt having been stolen, including by the Greeks, and that their contribution to European civilization is not recognized, as much as it ought to be recognized, and other people have written about it. Secondly, I think in the more recent periods, social sciences have been applied to African realities with a very clear desire to control. In the political domain, it is framed in terms of making Africans governable and inventing tools of of governance. In the economy, in the cultural realm, it is all about control. It's about having actually almost like a science of control and command, which is the opposite of the kind of science and the epistemic tools that we want to go back to in our own history and our present, which are epistemic tools and sciences that are emancipatory, that help us deal with everything from the legacies, including legacies of apartheid and our own histories, but also to help in working towards the total emancipation of Africans and enabling us to reconcile, with ourselves and our past and with our environment, but also invent mechanisms of governance that enable us to deal with, the vagaries of nature, the things that we don't have full control of, or our actions have led to changes that we seemingly have not been able to deal with, but it also means having, instruments of governance, if to put it very simply. Well, I think these are just some of the things, and that requires a lot of things. It requires, obviously, translation in the proper sense of the word, between cultures, between peoples. It requires us living the spirit of Ubuntu fully and sharing it and making it, I think a universal value. Let me stop here so that we can have time for a few exchanges. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sall. I'm just reminded that I think right now, in fact, the most audacious concepts that we're dealing with are actually coming from Professor Toyin Falola and his concept of the ritual archive. At least in history, that has really reinvigorated the way we are dealing with this concept of pluriversality. When you deal with this idea of a ritual archive, then you must study all facets of African society. I was also taken by this comment about, I think it was Samir Amin who said that the objective, I think, of CODESRIA was to really investigate the world in an independent and audacious fashion. And I'm not sure if we are still being audacious, never mind independent. So I think there are some questions here around the level at which we ourselves are being independent. I'll just read the comments and then I will invite Prof. Hendricks to pose his for himself. He says, I'd like to make a comment on where we currently stand as far as the production of knowledge is concerned on a global level. I agree very much with Ebrima about undercounting work done on the continent, but surely it's our duty to make that work visible and to ensure greater exposure and to encourage publications which cannot be ignored. Professor Okeja says, is it possible to construct an idea of the good society outside the framework of the global epistemological order? If yes, what African idea or concept do you think will help us to accomplish such a task? Of course, Uchenna, that's also your task to discover that at Emingeni Institute. More questions. Thank you for this great talk and conversation. May I ask how we can more deeply connect feminist epistemologies and tools and African epistemologies of the global South more generally? Another one, shifting epistemology requires African knowledge production that transcends scholars. Working with African states. Okay, so that's key. Working with African states to influence curriculum and teaching at all levels. I wonder how we're going to do that with so much privatization of education in Africa. So these are some of the questions we want to tackle. So this is a good basis for future questions for this seminar series. We want to do this, but we see an explosion of independent, low-fee private schools across the continent. Common practice has been the so-called expert consultants reviewing and changing curriculums in line with all epistemologies. African governments have to be sensitive to teaching curriculums and how they manage curriculums and knowledge. Yes, I know something about that. I sit on the task team for history in South Africa for school history. I'm going to just invite, I'll read the rest, but I'm going to just invite Professor Hendricks to make his point. If he can switch on his video, if possible, and his microphone, so we can just have an engagement there.
Hello, Nomalanga.
Hi, Fred.
Ebrima. Very nice to see you in this way. Well, fortunate and unfortunate in ways. Look, I enjoyed your talk very much, Ebrima. But don't you think that we need to start discussing ways in which we confront head-on the poverties across the continent as far as knowledge production is concerned? And that's primarily in the area of publications. So I agree very much that we need to ensure that there is a grounding of that knowledge production in the African experience. And I'm 100% behind the way in which you've couched that. But I do think that we have to confront the fact that we're only producing 2% of global book production. And it's appalling what we've done, or what we've managed to achieve so far. And so for us to continue to merely outline the problem instead of being engaged in ways which we actively correct it, and that is through being actively involved with publishing. I think it's a step that we simply have to take, because what I've noticed at very many conferences and workshops, I'm not mentioning this one in particular, about the position of African knowledge production within a global complex, is the notion of complaint. It is a complaint that defines how very many African scholars relate to an ongoing marginalization. And I think that we can't simply rely on complaint as our major form of agency in terms of global knowledge production. We simply have to get down to the hard task of writing and ensuring that our writing and our publications are of such a nature that they cannot be ignored by anybody. And that is, there are very definitely, if you look at CODESRIA, it's been a beacon of hope in that regard, no doubt about that. And there are other pockets of hope like that across the continent. But if you look at the way in which we have failed, and I say this quite guardedly, we have failed to develop the kind of international, within and continental levels of research cooperation that we need to do. If you look at virtually every African country, the overwhelming bulk of research cooperation is between an African country and almost invariably with the metropolitan country. And inter-African collaboration and research cooperation has not really taken off, despite many of the efforts by organizations like CODESRIA. And so I just think that there is a need for us to get down to the hard slog of starting journals, of writing books, and ensuring that they are what we are trying to put forward in a way is to demonstrate how the continent ought to be imaged by ourselves rather than by others. Thanks for giving me the chance, Nomalanga.
No, that's great, Fred. So what I will do is I will give you a chance, Dr. Sall, to respond. And remember, I think there were 3 other questions, but let me let you engage Fred, and then I'll remind you of the other questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks Fred for those great comments. I think I think we've been in this conversation for a long time, and I know, what you're calling complaint as a main, form of agency is obviously that's a non-starter. That definitely is not why we are here. And I think it doesn't take us far. But there a lot has been tried. I think you personally have been involved in starting this or Pan-Africanizing this African Sociological Journal concretely and running for 10 years or 11 years, putting in all the energy and the effort. It came out regularly. It was, compared to like as taken as seriously as, any other journal of sociology one could find anywhere. And I think there are a few things being tried in different places, but there obviously needs to be a lot more. And I agree with you completely. I think if the idea of forming continental networks and organizations like CODESRIA, where was to overcome obstacles, was out of an acute awareness of almost impossibility of going far within the narrow confines of the individual states that we have, and there are so many of them. That problem is as important today as it has ever been. I think we need to work beyond the country level. We need to build networks across the continent and across the South, and all those things have been tried. But, one of the big problems is not only having people, and now it is working very well. And one of the reasons why I think the contacts with the North are also so important is because many of the people we are working with in the North are people of our own, so that it's Africans teaching in some of the best universities in the North, reaching out to institutions on the continent and working with them as well. So that is doing well. But the important point here is who is paying for that? Who is paying for the collaboration within the continent? Who is paying for research to happen on the continent? Who is paying for the journals on the continent? Our governments are not putting money, with the exception of countries like South Africa and Algeria and a few others. Very few governments are really putting serious resources into higher education, research, knowledge production. So actually, CODESRIA is an interesting initiative in the sense that it is individual scholars coming together and institutions joining them to see what they can do together, what we can do together. You still need to have initiatives that are as important as what, for the sake of comparison, the European Union is saying they take research very seriously and they put so much, money into research and knowledge production and the mobility of scholars and students across the continent. If you are trying, again, South Africa is an exception here with the NIHSS and a few other institutions that have been doing extremely well in that regard. But I agree with you. I think we need to protest about, it's beyond complaining. I think we need to protest about the injustices of the global epistemological order and the epistemic injustices that exist, because they are doing a lot of damage. They are disruptive, they are destructive in a number of instances, right? So, but that is only the starting point, and I think a lot has been tried, putting in place frameworks. I mean, at one point we were talking about setting up an African Citation Index to deal with even the counting, to make sure that what counts for scholarship, maybe we look at the criteria again, maybe we look at the weighting, maybe we see what is existing in languages that are not in the main languages of scholarship, globally speaking today. We didn't have the resources to go far with that project either. And I think we have to be very clever in knowing how much we can do and what we must do on our own and not wait for anybody to come and try to rescue us. And I think the key to that, to any progress we are going to make there, is in the collective effort, is in joining hands and working together. Right. On the other hand, too, because of the resource issues and a number of other things that exist, it will be very difficult going forward. Yeah. So I think we are I take your points. I think you are spot on in what you are saying. But it's not. We shouldn't be in a defensive posture. I think that's what I take from what you are saying. We shouldn't be in a defensive posture and just be saying, okay, they are doing this for us, they are doing that for us. We need to know. I think we need to engage and be clever in how we engage. And one of the ways, the things that we need to do, and I've seen that happening in South Africa. You know, Andrea and I are in a other, you know, initiative looking at, you know, what happened with the NIHSS, you know, for example, and you see how creative people have been and how bold people have been to even think about, you know, creating mechanisms for what is produced within the African continent, within South Africa in particular, including books, you know, is rated and appreciated, you know, using criteria that make more sense to us than to others, which is, I think, fantastic. Right? So there are things happening, but I think what is happening needs to be connected together and needs to be scaled up. But the fundamental point is the point that you know, you Malanga, you reminded us of Samir saying we need to be audacious and bold in thinking about our own realities and the realities of the world in which we live.
Thanks. I mean, I think everyone knows I don't think we're being audacious enough ever. I don't think we are being audacious at all. If CODESRIA was formed by a generation that was being audacious, now as we transfer into a new period in which especially we look at the way universities operate, the way in which publications are incentivized and all that kind of strange stuff that actually leads to overproduction of knowledge, but underproduction of ideas. It's an interesting thing, or overproduction of publications, but underproduction of ideas. So to get out of that kind of system, somehow we need a level of audacity, which means, you know, looking at the DVCs and saying to them, no, we are no longer playing the game that's in the institution. So I think we need to address that. And I think we should note that for the team and all of us here, just going forward, Fred, I think it's a practical question. There's a practical answer, and I was hearing there's a practical issue here. How do you audaciously break from the current manner in which things are measured? So if we don't invent the manner in which we measure things differently, then we have to measure according to the way in which things are measured. So it would be very interesting to hear how CODESRIA and others have dealt with that. What was the failure in trying to reimagine a new measurement system?
Well, look, can I just quickly respond to that one? I think it was done in different ways. The first of all, just taking publishing as an important issue, you know, was to say, look, you know, we know what the politics of academic publishing are like, you know, globally speaking. Yeah, you know, you may be very good, and the Tanika Mkandawire, one of the most serious scholars we've had, his own personal experience writing on rebel movements on Sierra Leone and sending it to the Journal of Modern African Studies at one point, you know, just to hear himself said, look, so a reviewer suggesting, look, oh, well, you know what, this is interesting, but you should cut out the theory and just leave the ethnographic stuff. And he said, no, actually, the theory is what he is also trying to challenge, you know, so he needed to keep it there. But the point I'm making here is, you know, international journals, what makes them international is obviously how they are rated, how they are structured, the quality of what comes out through them, but there are other sides to it, as well. So CODESRIA deciding to launch its own journals or to support certain journals or to create something called an Africa Review of Books, which is a space for debate, for people to be able to say, look, this book might be called a good book in the West, but maybe in our own context, it makes no sense. And therefore, you should have a space and the possibility for somebody to be writing and saying, this book that people are celebrating elsewhere actually is flawed in so many different respects as well. So that was one way in which a framework was created for enabling people to be able to pass a judgment on what is scholarship or quality scholarship. Secondly, what we tried to do was to set up an African citation index. And we reached out to the Indians, you know, the Indian citation index, and then, you know, technically they helped us design something, but we needed money to operationalize that thing and make sure that it is functional at different countries and that people will begin to appreciate it and get, you know, what is produced in every country taken into account in what comes through the index. And after a while, maybe you will have the, you know, the measurement of what comes through as publications taking a different tone altogether in terms of at least the outputs. But I think it's not also only simple. You have international structures and you have the rankings, you have a race between the institutions, you're competing for resources globally and locally from the same sources as some of the institutions in the north. People have their careers to manage. You want to be recruited in a particular place, you better have your publications out in certain journals that are accredited in certain places and not in other places. So there are also those institutional dynamics that we must take into account. And again, I think we'll succeed in making headway in that whole struggle if we begin making sure that in deciding to recruit somebody at a particular university, well, it's not only important to have published in a journal that is in North America, but also journals that are recognized as important journals on the continent would count probably equally. But if the scholar in question is seeking to be recruited by a North American university, obviously he would seek or she would seek to be published elsewhere. But this is in, just a few of the different things that have been tried. But there is also a generational shift. I think you are right, Numalanga, when you are saying, or asking the question, are we as bold as the Samiramins tried to be? And they were bold, and they took risks, and they made sacrifices, in ways that maybe people are not willing to make anymore now. You after a small grant, you get it, you are there. You don't get it, you go elsewhere. You want research, your research funded by CODESRIA, they are not able to do it, or by another institution, then you go to the foundation that can fund you and you go there. And you can't blame people for doing that. But I'm just saying that there are many things that have changed in the context and in the way we work. But we need to have at least institutions, which is why I think this initiative that you guys have launched is extremely important, where there are attempts to anchor certain important processes. We had a great project on challenging orthodoxies in economic thinking, and it got us to look at feminist economics and look at how the university is one of the places where mainstream economics is reproduced in a big way. So you cannot rethink economics and challenge orthodoxies if you don't deal with curriculum reform and teaching, and what would make a degree or a particular kind of degree from a particular kind of university in economics appreciated by the employers or by other people elsewhere. So it's a whole set of dynamics that I think we need to take into account as well.
Can I invite Su Ming to make your question on feminism epistemologies there, if you're able to?
Yeah, I think I can. You can hear me, yeah? I've unmuted myself.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, okay. So really, I've been having this long thread in the chat with Professor Hendricks as well, and a few other people, about feminist tools and how we can, how can this Pan-African ideal, which is about creating a Pan-African canon, and also having tools which will promote the canon, enlarge the canon, take on Professor Hendricks' comment about enlarging production, really accelerating production, in your own comments about being audacious. So my question was really, how can we better integrate feminist tools with this move to create a greater standing and volume of Pan-African scholarship and the Pan-African episteme? And yeah, well, I've been like talking in the chat also about how, whether complaint is one of these tools. And one of the ways in which I've used this tool personally is I've complained. I've made an official complaint against my own institution because of the way they evaluate my own scholarly production. And asking them whether those who evaluate us are really competent to do so. It wasn't a successful complaint, and it was extremely frustrating, but that's just a tool, and an example of how complaint is a feminist tool, which is about creating a kind of learning within our own institutions, or possibly creating consciousness of learning in our own institutions, that it is possible to change, and perhaps they need to change.
Thanks, Dr. Sall.
That's I think, great, not one question, but a set of questions. Thank you very much. Look, I think on the latter bit, the possibility of lodging complaints, about, perceived injustices or the inappropriateness of the frameworks that are in place. That is one of the things that have helped move also the lines over the years. I think if feminist studies have, made headway, or certain changes have occurred in disciplines or in the interstices of disciplines, it is because people have been bold enough to make moves to say, okay, I think this way of appreciating or evaluating needs to be reviewed again. So I think you are, perfectly right. That is one thing to be taken into account. Of course, you always have a struggle. We are, it's an interesting experience here. We had a colleague of ours who in the Francophone system, they have what for a long time was a 2-tier PhD system where you could get a doctorate troisième cycle after 3 years or so, which is equivalent to a kind of MPhil. Then you could spend 10 or 15 years to do your doctoral data, right? So a very good scholar, social anthropologist, did his doctoral data on gender, a man doing gender studies at the university in social anthropology, then getting into a big fight with his own department. And they said, look, well, there's a problem of quality with this thing. This is not really science. And and one of the ways in which they fought him or they tried to fight him was to say, look, oh, well, you know what? When that argument wasn't sufficient, the thing was, we don't have resources to bring you the external examiners that you needed, because he needed to bring 2 scholars from North America to be part of the panel. And then he came to see us and said, look, I need help. These guys want to frustrate my thesis. So anyway, to cut a long story short, there are many ways in which the institution will fight back. And it's a genuine fight. I think some of they literally will hold on to particular views and paradigms for a long time, and it will take an effort. It will take a fight before the shifts can occur, right? And I think that's true of many disciplines. It is also true of feminist studies in particular. But from that point to see how do you advance, particular methodologies or particular paradigms in a system, that is a whole other ball game, I would say. Again, to take this simple example of challenging orthodoxies in economic thinking, we deliberately made sure that almost 40%, at least a minimum of 40% of the participants were feminist economists. It ended up with a conference in Dakar in 2019, September 2019. You had to make special efforts to make sure that you create the spaces, you reach out to particular voices and to particular, people and institutions to be able to get the kind of participation that is required at the minimum. But it's again about institutional logics, and about processes that are beyond what you can do, in a limited circle. Depending on who is on the ground and what the numbers are and who is heading the institution and what support they can mobilize within and outside, you may have certain things changing in a much faster way than others. I mean, it took the University of Dakar in Senegal here about 40 years for them to get a department of gender studies, or not even a department, just a center. I mean, Fatou Sow, one of the leading feminist scholars of this continent, for almost all her life, until she retired, she wasn't able to establish a gender research center. And they had to hide gender studies under sociology or other things. And then suddenly it opened up, and they were able to have 2 centers in 1 year, led by 2 great scholars, and other things followed. So there's a lot of, elements that come into determining what actually will open the spaces up and create the structures. But I think what certainly must continue is the determination of the people who are genuinely involved, in those fields and who want to advance the issues and the debates to just keep doing so and reaching out to allies at every level, I would say. And the networks are Southern, you have had a number of institutions and networks that have been doing great work.
Thanks. I think that's another thing just to take note of for us to continue to talk about that. I mean, I think the there is a question there always about the gender question in the Pan-Africanist space, which is always fraught because we also have to deal with gender imperialism from the North. And that always creates a fracture in the feminist space because of the kind of sort of gender sort of agendas of Northern-based academic spaces. So those things fracture the discussion. If I can just, I'm going to let me just outline what will happen now. I will invite two people. I'm just going down the list. I see Winnie and I see Emmanuel. So I will invite them to put their questions to you. Then I will invite Professor Okeja to just do just a short response and closing remarks, just thank you remarks to everybody. And then we will, once that has been done, we'll then, we'll see if there's room for another 2 more questions. So if I can invite Winnie, and then I'll ask after Winnie, Emmanuel to pose their questions. If Winnie is still here. I know that it's now 4:30. Is Winnie still around? Okay, so I don't. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so Emmanuel, is Emmanuel still around? There's yes. Emmanuel. Okay, thanks. You can just pose your question. Thank you.
All right. How do we mobilize ourselves to influence our vice chancellors, the administrators of our universities, to adopt outlooks, measures that can help our scholars locally to forge, create ideas that help our own societies? Because as long as they adopt metrics of assessment that demand them to publish in European journals or journals that are driven by agendas in the North, most of our scholars will not be bold enough to look inward and forge new ideas, helpful ideas for our own societies. That would be my question. Thank you.
Okay, there's Oriole. If Oriole is still here, they can also pose a question. I don't know if Oriole is still here. Oh, there we go. Oriole, thank you.
Hi, I was just responding to a thread that was in the chat talking about how we can fit our knowledge into global epistemologies. And someone commented that perhaps we shouldn't concentrate on African epistemologies, but rather be looking at the world as a whole in order to contribute better. And I was thinking, surely it's necessary for us to understand where we are coming from as Africans first, before we can contribute to knowledge worldwide.
Okay, no, thanks. So what we'll do is I'll give you one last opportunity to respond, Doctor, and then Professor Okeja will thank everybody for us. Thanks.
Look, yeah, thanks to the the colleagues, to Emmanuel and to Aurelie. How do you mobilize our vice chancellors to adopt, different kinds of metrics, and to the vice chancellors are not the easiest people to mobilize. I think it, probably has to work, at 2 levels. Obviously, within each institution and within each community, it may be difficult even to do it at the level of just one institution, but to have the community, it's South Africa or it's at the African continent, to have, a debate and people reaching out to each other and then beginning to question the metrics that are used. I think that's one level. The other level is they are also organized. You have ARUA, the Association of the Alliance of Research Universities of Africa. There's the Association of African Universities, and then there are debates that exist at that level. And one can just hope that, at some point, maybe some progressive trends will tend to prevail. Now, this is more difficult in the Francophone world, where they have one organization called CAMES, the Conseil Africain Malgache, on the l'enseignement supérieur that sort of regulates academic careers and curricula, broadly speaking, across the Francophone world and up to Madagascar. So if you're applying to be promoted to associate professor, maître de conférence, or be a full professor, you actually don't apply to your own country, you apply to CAMES. And the headquarters of CAMES is in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. That is a much more difficult institution to change. And I think the metrics will change again, maybe if the struggles begin happening at the country level and people begin questioning, how the selections are made, the qualifications are made. There's the whole debate, about the process itself, depending on the disciplines and the committees. There are discipline committees and some interdisciplinary fields having their own committees as well. So you apply, and every year it's the same time. You know that CAMES is meeting at this particular time of the year, and everybody's rushing to get their publications out, and then to be able to see whether they can be considered for promotion to this or that. But it's a centralized process. Good for Pan-Africanism. It's getting people out of their own countries to discuss these issues collectively. But there's also a lot of there's a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of in French what they call mandarina. If the big names, the heavyweights, occupying the spaces, because it has a consequence. Having a number of people recognized as professors, it also tells you actually how many people can qualify to be heads of department or to be deans of faculties. That's all determined by who goes through, who gets appointed at one point. So there's a regulation of the flow, that is tied to positions and interests within the institution. So it's a very complex process. But I think it needs to be challenged in different ways. There has to be an engagement. But I think it's beyond what can be resolved at the level of just one VC. There has to be a collective movement. Really, I think African epistemologies, obviously, yes, I think we should be interested in African epistemologies. But as I said, when CODESRIA was being established, the point was not to say, look, let's figure out something that is African and for Africa, and then that would not make sense to the rest of the world. I think that wasn't the idea at all. And so I think there's a way of being part of these debates at the discipline level, at the interdisciplinary level, at the community level globally, or across the South, in which, certain issues can be posed, in a very open way, without there being, the impression of some, fences being created or ghettos being created, to use a derogatory term, within the community itself. So I think talking about African epistemologies, I think there's a whole debate on that one. And the people who are in the debate, I think it's a legitimate debate to have. And, but to say that, my priority is to work on African epistemologies, and if I'm heading an institution, you can't break out of the order, sort of issues or framework alone. I mean, I remember, Adam Habib of Wits University making this point at one point, that if you take the rankings, for example, okay, we know all the problems with the rankings, but does it make sense to try to break out of the rankings as an individual university? You are better off taking it or approaching the issue collectively as South African universities or as African universities, and then you are likely to make greater progress than if you say, well, look, you know what, I don't care about the rankings, but the people you have among your staff do care about the rankings. It has a consequence on who wants to come to register as a student at a university. It has a consequence, the perceptions and the rating of your own institution at the end of the day, whether you like it or not. So yeah, I think it's a whole set of issues that probably need to be handled in a nuanced way. But the fundamental issue for me, it's not about having a special kind of science or a sub-science for Africa, or sub-epistemologies or things that make sense only in our realities. That would sort of disconnect us from the rest of the global community. And I think that would not be good at all. But we should be going to the global community fully confident about what we are contributing to the table, and getting our own contributions acknowledged as well. And that is what will take us to people talk about pluriversality now, but Senghor, former president of Senegal many years ago, used to talk about what he called a rendezvous du donner et du recevoir. That is a rendezvous of you give and you receive. Everybody comes with something. Everybody gets something from the collective gatherings, from the rendezvous when you get there. Right? It's not a question of some distributing to others or others being, at the receiving end of a particular setup. So for me, that's the important thing here. And how do you work it out? You work it out at the individual level, at the institutional level, publish, right? Make sure that our systems and processes work and make sense in different contexts. Voila.
Thank you so much for that response. Can I now invite Professor Uchenna Okeja just to do some thank yous as we wrap up?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nomalanga. I would like to thank our speaker today, Dr. Ebrima Sall. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Not just the talk, but also the responses, thinking together with all of us about these very complicated issues. We definitely have learned a lot from this conversation, and there will be room to continue the dialogue, the conversation going forward. Thank you very much. To all of you who made time to be here today, I'd like to say thank you very much. I mean, it is always good to be together as a community, because without the people participating in the conversation, nothing really gets off the ground. Just to give you an idiom, there is this proverb amongst the Igbo people of Nigeria that says that the frog said that having a husband is such a wonderful thing. So when the frog got married, it decided to carry its husband permanently on the back. And let us not be like the frog. We, of course, might have, become acculturated in different knowledge systems, but surely there is something about the experience that we have had, either as individuals located in a particular geographical space, or as people who have formed communities with histories. There is something about those things that position us, like Dr. Sall said, to contribute alongside other people in this world to the project of humanizing the world. I think that is all that we are trying to do, to make the world a habitable place for the entirety of humankind. It is precisely because of the crisis of habitation in Africa that you see terrible things like, forced migration, African youth dying in the Mediterranean just to have a chance to be humans. So it is precisely because of this crisis that we have to take very seriously the task of contributing to whatever it will take to humanize the world. So thank you very much to also my colleagues, to the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Andrew Kate, Nomalanga Mkize, and Jenny and Anel. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you, and thanks to the Menkidi family for the support to the Emengini Institute. I think that the Emengini Institute, working together with the different institutions within the Nelson Mandela University family, is really going to do great things. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon if you are in South Africa. If you are in the United States or wherever, then have a wonderful day or morning or whatever it is where you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Just take note, we are having 6 of these this year, and they're going to be very audacious and pointed. And I think Dr. Ebrima has given us a very strong foundation, and we're going to take these things into a much sharper direction as we get into these nitty-gritties. Thank you so much, Dr. Sall. Thank you, Prof. Geert. Everyone can switch on their mics and say goodbye. Yeah.
Thanks, Ebrima.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye, everybody.
for your time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, Uchenna, Namalanga.